I'm going to say it in a nice way. You get the flatterer award of the week. Okay. I was going to say something else, but I decided against it.
I got the idea.
Okay. Mem Dalid. The imhushlash biyado shtarchov. Okay, let's say Reuven and Shimon enter into a transaction. Let's say there's a loan that takes place. Reuven lends Shimon 100,000, and there's a promissory note. They give it to the escrow person who's Levi, and part of the escrow instructions are that if this note is not paid in full by a certain date, then Yachzer Hashlisha Tashtar Liyad Hamalva. Then the escrow should return the promissory note to the creditor. Ve'ein yadua lashlish in kfar nifram miktsasa. The escrow person, Levi, has absolutely no idea about any other details. Was this loan partially paid? Was it not partially paid? Basically, he's given an envelope that has a promissory note, and he looks at the escrow instructions, and it basically says if this loan has not been paid in full in your presence or to your satisfaction, like in other words, that if it hasn't been demonstrated to you that the loan has been paid back, you hereby are instructed to return this paperwork to Reuven, the Malva. And the custodian has no idea whether there's been partial payment on the loan. He just doesn't know. And the time has elapsed. The debtor has not brought payment to the escrow. And so he doesn't know. So he basically now he's got to fulfill the instructions. He says, so he's just got to fulfill his escrow instructions. He should return the paperwork, the promissory note should be returned to the creditor, and he doesn't have to worry that maybe it was already paid. Even if it was never stated explicitly that the money should be brought to the escrow and the debt should be paid in his presence. He says, why is that? He says, because if indeed the lova, the debtor, had already paid back the loan, he would have done so in the presence of the escrow company. I mean, after all, if you agreed in your escrow instructions that if the loan is not paid back by a certain date, that the escrow should give the paperwork back to the creditor, then obviously it's implicit that you're not going to pay back the debt without notifying the escrow company. Because so in other words, it's not the escrow person's duty to track down what happened. Did the debtor pay back the debt or not? If it's not done in my presence, then I have every right to assume that the debt was not paid back. And therefore, I'm just going to give back the paperwork to the creditor. And that's what you're supposed to do. Because if the lova claims, the debtor claims, I paid it already, well, then why didn't you come and claim the promissory note? Why didn't you come and pick it up? Why didn't you come and in my presence either give me the cash or call the creditor to my office and the two of you settle up in my presence so that I would know what has transpired? The fact that you didn't implies that you never did this. And I don't care how much you're jumping up and down saying you paid it. I have to fulfill my proxyship. I have to fulfill my escrow instructions. And that is eminently logical. Okay, does anyone see why that makes sense? Okay, good. So there's not even any Imrei Yaakov on this, just pretty straightforward. Memhei, aval kodem shehigia hazman. But let's say before the date arrives, where in the escrow instructions say, if Shimon doesn't pay the debt back by February 1st, return the note to Reuven. So it's not February 1st yet. It's January 26th. Okay? Imba hamal v'lachzarbo v'litol shtaru miyad hashlish lo yachzirenu lo. If the creditor comes and says, I'd like to pick up my promissory note, but February 1st hasn't arrived, my instructions are to hold on to this until February 1st to see if the debt has been paid back. If it hasn't, but if that date has not yet arrived, then I have no right to give you back that paper. Afilu hishlisho hamalva me'atzmo shalomi das haloven. And that's true even if the paperwork was delivered to the escrow holder just by the creditor and not by the debtor. In other words, it's possible that the debtor trusted the creditor to bring the promissory note to the escrow company and to deposit it there. And the debtor says, I trust you. So the debtor makes partial payment to the creditor, and he says, do me a favor, I've paid you back 30,000 from the 100,000, I owe you now 70,000. So in order to make sure that you don't collect the entire amount, leave it with an escrow company, and you'll give them the escrow instructions that only when I pay you back 70,000 shall you relinquish the promissory note back to the debtor. But if I don't pay you back by February 1st, give the paperwork back to the malva. The malva goes ahead and deposits that with an escrow company. He then comes before February 1st and says, the guy just told me he's not going to be able to make the deadline, so I'm here to pick up the paper. So the escrow person says, excuse me, it's only January 26th. You gave me explicit instructions to hold on to this until February 1st. I'm not able to give it to you. And that's really the halacha. And in the parentheses, he says as follows: Shekeven sheharchava zu shehirchiv hamalves hazman piron lo hayabo but tanai klal. He says, and the reason is because the instruction was very simple. It said, hold on to this until February 1st, and if the debt is not paid by February 1st, give it back to the malva. There were no other conditions stipulated that it could be interpreted that he could relinquish it before then. Okay, ve'ein badin asmachta, and there's no issue of an asmachta here that the malva didn't mean to be taken seriously. So zacha b'haloive below shum kinyan. So you have to protect the rights of the debtor in this case, and the debtor is the one who has a right to say, don't give it back to the malva. Shaharehu muchzak b'ma'osav, because the lova, after all, is considered to be the muchzak, the holder of his funds in this case. Until February 1st arrives, there's absolutely no rights of collection. Avol mesinas hashlishus lemisha zacha ba'al pi hatanai she'isna hamashlish yesh ba din asmachta lifa'amim v'yachol lachzor bo. He says, however, let's see, I'm not sure what this line means over here. We'll have to look at the Imrei Yaakov. Aval nesinas hashlishus lemi shezacha ba'al pi hatanai shehisna hamashlish yesh ba din asmachta lefa'amim v'yachol lachzor bo ela im kain kanu miyado bebeis din chashuv. He says, however, there are going to be instances where a stipulation is made by the person who gives the documents to the escrow company that are not meant to be taken seriously. Clearly, it's an exaggerative statement, and should not therefore be listened to unless it's a kinyan is made in an established beis din. And there are other times when the conditional statement is meant to be taken seriously, and therefore neither party can retract it. And it's for that reason that any person who's going to act as an escrow person is going to be a holder of cash or documents on behalf of the two parties entering into a transaction has to be very well versed in the halachos of asmachta. In other words, he has to know when a condition is exaggerative and when it's meant to be taken literally. So I'm not sure why he's including that over here, but what he's basically saying is that whenever there are very clear instructions and there's no ambiguity in those instructions, the escrow person must follow through on those instructions, even if he's pressured to alter the terms before the, let's say, the due date. Okay, and he has to look out to protect the interests of both parties, both the interests of the creditor and the interests of the debtor. But he also has to know that sometimes a condition is not meant to be taken literally, and it's meant only exaggeratively, and he has to know the difference between the two. And that's sort of like a summation of all the last few seifim, where it's sort of like the escrow person has a lot of, sometimes he has to be very careful in his deliberation about what the facts are of the case, because sometimes something is so outlandish as far as a condition that he knows it's not meant to be taken seriously, and he's got to know that. So let's see what the Imrei Yaakov says over here. Kuf Pei Beis. If let's say the Ba Hamal V'Lachzarbo, if let's say the creditor comes before February 1st and says, please give me back the note. Let's say the illustration that he gives is that the malva, the creditor, gives the promissory note to the escrow holder, and he says, even after the debtor pays me the debt in full, I want you to be holding this document for an extra week or an extra few days. Maybe it's to make sure the check is cleared or whatever it is. In other words, I don't want you to give the note to the debtor outright until a week after payment is made. Okay? And as long as both of them agree to this, then it's perfectly legitimate for the creditor to say, this is the condition of the loan. You can't take back the promissory note even after you pay back the debt. You have to wait 7 days. Or I think what he's saying is that he says the due date for the loan is February 1st. Oh, this is the case. The due date for the loan is February 1st, but the creditor says that I want you to hold on to this note until February the 8th, a week later, and then I'm going to come and pick it up, and at that time I want you to give it to me. So what he's saying is that even in a scenario where the promissory note clearly says that the loan matures on February 1st, but the escrow instruction was that he will only come and pick up the promissory note on February 8th, the escrow company should not give it to him before February 8th, even though the note says that the debt is collectible on February 1st. So why he did it this way, it doesn't matter, but there was never any kind of stipulation to contradict those very explicit instructions. So the escrow company should not relinquish the paper to the creditor, even though they know the debt is already mature, until the date that was provided to them. Right, as long as it's stipulated in the instructions, exactly. And therefore, tzarech lios hashlish baki. The shlish therefore has to be an expert in matters of asmachta, because sometimes there are things that are meant to be taken literally, and sometimes there are things that are not. And he says, Ayin sof simin nun vav, shehel lahashach tamtzit v'sikum inyanei shlishut, v'kitzur lahalacha. I refer you, he says, to the end of simin nun vav, where the shach sort of gives a summation of all of the laws of shlishut, of custodianship. Okay, so maybe what I'll do is for tomorrow, I'll put together that shach and we'll look at it inside together of what your fiduciary duties are when you're called upon to act as a third party custodian or escrow person. Okay. Who's giving the instruction?
One of the weekend. It's not stipulated. So it's, it's February 1st is a new day. Don't give the document back until the payment is completely clear. But it's not stipulated. It's a forgot to put it. So they cannot hold the document.
Right. Well, the custodian needs to know for a fact that the payment was made. If indeed the debtor pays back with a check, then that's not evidence that the debt has been paid. So it could be that in that kind of situation, the escrow company has to verify that the funds are now in the bank account of the creditor before he gives the promissory note back to the debtor. Okay, so it could be that just the fact that a check was given in the presence of the escrow person is not sufficient evidence that the debt has been paid. I would argue that that's not sufficient evidence. What if he gives him a bad check? Okay, we'll hold it here for today. Have a great